Hello guys, I'm the Builder and let's take a look at history. We're gonna cover the Vickers Medium Mark 1, 2 and 3 today. In this video, basically I'm gonna take a look at the historical background of the tanks, how they operated, how they performed, doctrine of the time, tactics. I'm not so much gonna go into the in-game versions of the tank, maybe offer a bit criticism, like the radio operator who doesn't operate radio because the tank didn't have one, or at least if it had one, it was on the turret, where it was operated by the commander, not the radio operator, which, well, makes it, yeah, it's a bit stupid, but generally I won't cover stuff like in-game tactics, how many tanks you can penetrate, or how you angle your tank. That's not what I'm trying to cover here. Trying to only cover the historical background where my specialty lies. So anyway, the Vickers Medium series. 3 tanks. 2 are almost identical actually. The Vickers Medium Mark 1 and Mark 2 are relatively identical. I mean, you can't distinguish them that easily purely from the silhouette, so yeah. The Mark III is very distinctly different from the 2 tanks. I'm going to cover it at the end. First off, let's start with the Vickers Medium Mark I. Let's start at a bit different topic, the British tank doctrine at the time. Basically, they were having these Vickers Medium Mark I tanks, and they had the Mark IV. That huge brick with the sponsor-mounted guns and tracks on top. That's the Mark IV. Now, point is, what they thought tanks would work like is they would have a heavier variant, in this case the Mark IV, which would create some sort of gap in the enemy defense. It's not going to be bunkers in a row, and bam, you have a gap in the enemy line. And then they would have lighter tanks, in this case the Vickers Medium Mark I, which would go through the gap and cause any kind of damage behind the enemy lines, because you see, the enemy's gonna concentrate the troops on the defensive line, not somewhere clustered behind it. So the tank will have pretty little resistance and could create a lot of damage, win a lot of ground, stuff like that. So they were developing a tank that could move reasonably fast, with of course still have tracks, because the scout cars were wheeled. They were at that time sort of the light tanks of the time, which were used to exploit such a breakthrough, but as I said, they had wheels, and World War I they had lots of trenches, which meant skycars would get struck because wheeled vehicles cannot cross a trench. It's physical impossibility, so they needed a tracked vehicle first off. Tracked vehicles at that time were mildly improvised at best. I mean, the Saint-Germain, for example, it's just a huge brick that's actually longer than its own track, so even tracked vehicles weren't always capable of crossing trenches. So, basically, Vickers proposed this design. It had helical spring suspension, a house-made 3-pounder gun, which was actually a naval gun, and 3 Vickers machine guns. Actually, early versions still had Hotchkiss machine guns. Different caliber. British thought, nah, we'll use our own ones. Vickers said, oh, we got a machine gun right here. So they put in Vickers machine guns. It had a Armstrong Siddeley V8 engine with 90 horsepower. Obviously, it's mounted here in the front, not like in most tanks in the back. And it's right next to the driver too. The driver sitting right here, to the right of the engine. Relatively good field of view. And right behind him you've got a 3-man turret. It's got a commander sitting in this sort of house-like escape hatch. Then you've got a gunner and a loader. Actually, don't quote me on the position of the loader and gunner, but those should be the positions, because most tanks have them placed that way. The gunner's on the right of the gun, the loader on the left, because most people are right-handed, and if you sit left of the gun, you're gonna push the shell in with the right hand, so obviously makes sense. And the radio would normally be mounted on the back of the turret, just behind the commander, and operated by the commander. Now, what I was going on about earlier, the radio operator, was the radio operator in this tank actually does not sit in the turret or operate the radio at all. He's actually the machine gunner, and he operates the two machine guns you got on the left and the right of the hull. So he's more likely more like a gunner, not a radio operator. And effectively, if you would kill the radio operator, you would terminate two machine guns, which are essentially useless in World of Tanks anyway. Because the commander... yeah. And if you were to kill the commander, you would render the radio inoperable. So, essentially, that's making that very confused, because the radio operator doesn't operate the radio point over. He's the machine gunner, nothing more. The best you could do to him is make him an additional gunner. That would at least be logical. And let the commander double as the radio operator, because that's how the tank worked, if it at all had a radio. Because at that time, they didn't really much think about having radios in tanks. They had a few command variants that had radios in, but usually most of the tanks had signal flags. See, you could see them up to 90 meters. Probably less. Anyway, now, thing is, the tank is very light because it had to be very fast, and so they made the armor very thin, 6mm all around on the hull. And don't get me wrong on this, 6mm probably does protect you from normal bullets most of the time. But if I sat in that tank and a machine gun started firing on me, I would be scared, because I think 6mm are not enough against machine gun fire, even if they use normal ammunition and not any kind of armor-piercing ammunition. I personally think 10mm is the border where you can stop normal bullets. Anything less and you gotta fear. You gotta fear anything that hits you, even if they are throwing stones at you. That's sort of my mental border. So I would honestly think 6mm, not a safe amount of armor. But usually you don't hit the armor square face, so it's most of the time angled, because they didn't care much about whether the tank was at an angle. They shot anyway, mostly because of panic, so usually you would deflect those bullets. Sure thing. So usually the armor withstood most rifle fire, but Germans by then would have had anti-tank rifles if this thing actually got used in World War I. Another thing is the three-man turret. You know why a three-man turret is in a tank? Because you then have the commander not having to operate the gun too, or load the gun, depending on the tank. I mean, the Russian T-34 is a good example. German commanders noted that the T-34 had a long time, needed a long time to finally shoot at a target, to identify and then shoot at a target. That was because the commander also operated the gun, because they had a two-man turret. That way the commander had to first peek through his periscope, look for a tank, and then go to the gun and use the gunner against it. In a three-man turret, you can have the gunner shoot at one target while the commander already searches for the next one. That way you save a lot of time, mostly. That was very beneficial for the tank, if it were ever used outside training, which it wasn't, so nobody noticed that kind of difference. And nobody got the idea to build two-man turrets again after that Vickers Medium Tank. So British went back to two-man turrets with the Matilda and Valentine. Or at least partially. I mean, as they upgunned the Valentine, they had to erase one crew member because the turret was simply too small otherwise. So they had a two-man turret again. Awkward to use, but worked out reasonably well. But they never noticed the difference simply because the tank was never actually used in combat. was pure training tank. Pure parade tank. Never saw any actual kind of fighting. And also the helical spring suspension was nothing really advanced at the time. It was working, okay, it was a suspension. They were at that time lucky to have a suspension on the tank at all. Even it was somehow breaking down all the time. But at least you had a suspension, you could ride reasonably comfortable. And your construction didn't shake itself apart while moving. Because that was a genuine problem with most World War I tanks. They had no suspension, so riding on them was pretty much a very uncomfortable business. If the thing just didn't shake itself apart outright. But on the other hand, the suspension itself added weight, and especially with faster tanks, they tried to keep the weight low and simply did not build any kind of suspension into the tank. Okay, anyway, that so far covers the Medium Mark I. Covered every major aspect. Moving on to the Mark II. You may see a few slight differences here. The skirt armor on the tracks is a bit more, well, covers a bit more as it progressed. On both sides, by the way. They got armored covers for the headlights, just to make them less visible to the enemy, because if you look from that angle, you wouldn't see the headlights. For most angles, you wouldn't actually see the headlights, but they still can project down on the ground, where the driver needs to see, obviously. Also, the driver's whole seat was elevated a bit, so that it was actually, he was actually sitting in front of the turret. The gun was still the same Vickers built 3-pounder gun, with Vickers machine guns, again 2 machine guns on the hull. Again this little house, but they added an armored box for the radio on the back of the turret. That's what I was talking about earlier, where the radio's on the back of the turret on basically all British tanks. Meaning that the radio operator, who's probably that poor guy operating the machine guns, is nothing close to radio operator. Well, the suspension didn't change much, the engine didn't change much, the tank was minimally faster, and the armor protection was increased to 8mm all around. But that wasn't much done with the tank. Was exported to India, I believe. But again, it didn't see any great combat. No one noticed the 3-man turret. So, genuinely, training tank again. Reasonably good design for the time, but never got used. Now, let's go to the Vickers Medium Mark III. You see, this tank changed a lot. First off, you'll notice it's got an entirely different form. It's looks a bit like it's got a bit of a triangular shape, like a water drop. The backside is very sloped, and you may notice something like if you look at the back. 2 exhaust pipes. Now, usually most cars have 1 exhaust pipe. So why would you have 2 exhaust pipes if not for super duper sports car sound? Right, you got 2 engines. To be exact, 2 Armstrong Siddeley engines with 90 horsepower each. Also, they changed the turret again, having the box seem less improvised on the turret. I mean, if you look back here, the box, really, you see it's simply put onto the turret like a tumor. It doesn't really fit on there. On the Mark III, it's actually an integrated part of the turret, with the radio, commander, gunner, loader, gunner, and 1 machine gun in the main turret, and 2 in the secondary turrets. This was one of the first tanks to actually use secondary turrets at that time. Multi-turret tanks were a bit, well, you could say they were in fashion. And also the suspension system changed. instead of helical springs, they used coil springs that were sort of put around an L lever. So the actual springs were horizontal instead of vertical, which meant they probably saved a good bit of space. Also, the ride was a bit more comfortable because the road wheels had a bit more space to go up and down with the tank, meaning that the ride was a lot more comfortable and faster too. The tank was very much faster. It actually reached about 40 kilometers per hour, so it was actually up to the task of a medium tank, exploiting a breakthrough, going through faster than any tank that could actually defeat it. So they still had the same 3-pounder gun, and they had those secondary machine gun turrets. Still a 3-man turret, driver, and then you get 2 radio operators again. And those are, I'm 90% sure, those poor guys in the turrets. Now, yeah. Being in that turret is a nasty job. I mean, okay, you get your very own turret with your very own machine gun. And it might be a lot of fun staying in there, shooting at infantry trying to run at your tank. But those extra turrets are usually only extra weight because the machine guns of a tank, well, okay, they work probably reasonably effective, but having a turret completely only for a single machine gun when you could just as well use a ball mount like on more modern tanks like, let's say, the Cromwell. See, ball mounted machine gun. Simple, it's in the front, you can simply put it in, use it, and you don't have to construct an entire turret around that. Although with a turret you can shoot in a way wider arc. Now the driver sits between the 2 turrets. Now the problem is, if you sit inside such a turret and a shell hits you, you've got nowhere to go. You can't duck very well inside there, you can't lean anywhere, you basically can't move anywhere at all. It's pretty cramped inside such a turret. So if a shell hits you, it hits you dead in the face, even if you could move at light speed and evade a shell somehow flying at your face. So usually being in the machine gun turret was a bad job. Also, the turrets have another problem. If you, let's say, shot with something like an anti-tank rifle, something that a German anti-tank rifle, because they only had an 8mm anti-tank rifle, or 7.92mm if you want to be exact. Something that wouldn't penetrate the frontal turret armor. Like, let's say you hit it exactly there. You know what would happen? If you look at it from the top, you would see the shell would ricochet into the side of the driver's compartment. That's what's called a shot trap. If the armor is placed in a way that if a ricochet occurs, it will hit the tank itself again, and probably get stuck in some sort of place where it might, for example, block the turret or something like that. That's something you should normally avoid when designing a tank. For modern tanks, that's not so much of an issue because shot trap, modern ammunitions like heat shells usually don't, well, I should say, fall for shot traps. They simply explode on the armor and don't ricochet off. If they don't penetrate, they don't penetrate, but they always explode and try to penetrate. But they can't ricochet and hit somewhere else again, usually. Now, anyway, another thing you might notice is the very close similarity. Let me buy a new slot here. Buy a vehicle. Medium tanks. USSR. Yeah, I'm getting at that tank. Now, where did I put it? Because somehow they have fun rearranging the nations each patch. Yeah, this tank. I mean, if you look very closely, it's a tank. Okay, it doesn't have the same triangular shape, but it's got one main turret and 2 machine gun turrets and in the middle between the driver. And now, where did we see that design? Oh yeah, right, just a few seconds ago on the Medium Mark III. Basically, what happened, the Soviets copied the design. They somehow sent the Skype to Britain, got the design somehow, and sort of redesigned it with Russian parts. leading to the T-28. And, well, they obviously put on a bit heavier armor than the British. I mean, 14mm of armor is usually not a big obstacle for anti-tank rifles. 9mm side armor, even less. But it was reasonably fast. It had reasonably good armament. A 3-pounder gun was very good armament at the time. Most tanks were armed with 37mm guns. A 3-pounder has a caliber of 47mm. So it was a very good tank gun, very good dual-purpose gun, especially because it had a very good balance between caliber and armor-piercing capability. Because if you compare, let's say, compared to the Panther, the L100 gun, it's a pure anti-tank gun because it's a very long. So it has a very good performance against tanks. But if you were to shoot it against infantries, it would basically be a very bad gun. Because if you have a very long barrel, you have a very high muzzle velocity. Very high muzzle velocity means, again, very much internal stress in the shell. And if you need a shell to withstand these stresses, you need to make it more sturdy, making the shell walls thicker. And everything that is shell walls is not explosive. So basically, having a high velocity anti-tank gun means you're gonna have less explosive in your high explosive shells. So you're trying to get a cannon that works somewhere in between, like in this case a 3-pounder. Another decent enough example is probably I don't know actually. Yeah, I don't have any other guns that sort of fit in the same balance. But usually, the Cromwell 75mm gun, the historical one, this one. That's also a good example. It's got reasonably good armor penetration, but also a very good high explosive shell. I mean, okay, good anti-tank performance is probably a bit of an understatement. It had pretty horrible armor-piercing performance, but I mean, it was a balanced gun. Same for the 3-pounder. Now, anyway, you get, yeah, you got 2 engines, cross-spring suspension, secondary turrets, but this tank was the first Vickers tank that didn't get accepted for service or mass production. Vickers made a few prototypes, I believe 4 or 5, more or less, so the tank didn't really see any kind of action, saw a few trials, that's all. But at that time they were starting to work on the cruiser tanks and the infantry tanks correspondingly, and the medium tanks simply didn't fit in the infantry cruiser tank doctrine, which at that time the British started applying. So they dropped the Vickers Medium Tank. The fun fact is they used the same suspension on the Matilda infantry tank again, the Matilda II that is. So parts of the tank actually lived on. I mean, obviously the T-28 was a highly successful tank on the Soviet end. As it was basically a clone, you could say the Vickers tank would have performed equally well. But on the other hand, the tank simply, the British didn't have any use for it in their doctrine. They tried to save costs, save money, tried to build cheap tanks like the Matilda I, which was basically a box with a machine gun turret on top and trucks on either side. Even more of a crude construction than the Vickers Medium Mark I, which, by the way, looks a bit crude, if you ask me. It looks a bit like a fridge on tracks. So it deserves the nickname more than the T2 medium tank, pardon me. So anyway, we covered a series of tanks. That was a genuinely good series. The evolving concept of the Vickers medium tank. And, well, in the end, it got dropped because the British tried to save money and had a new doctrine. And the whole tactical concept of a tank got obsolete. Next time I'm going to do such a video, it will be about the British infantry tanks, like the Matilda, the Churchill and stuff like that. I will either do this while this beta is still in effect, or in the next beta phase, because obviously I don't have enough slots and stuff like that and money to buy all the tanks just to make videos. It's simply not possible, sorry guys. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Leave some comments for this. I'm trying to assess whether you like this. Anyway, I'll see you some other time.